Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Enterprise Tuesday. My name is Bruno Cotter, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Entrepreneurship Centre. Before we start, I've been asked to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for attendees on YouTube. As many of you will be aware, this week, the UK is hosting the 26th UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. So it's a perfect moment for us, I think, to start this year's series with a focus on the role of entrepreneurship in tackling two unprecedented challenges of our time: sustainability, of course, and climate change. I'm delighted, therefore, to introduce our chair for this evening's discussion, Dr. Nicky D, who I know is deeply passionate about this topic. Nicky is co-founder and Chief Sustainability and Innovation Officer at Carbon 13, a venture builder here in Cambridge, and a Senior Associate with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. She's worked extensively with academia, industry and government organisations in the UK, Europe and beyond, as well as with many like-minded innovators and entrepreneurs. Thank you, Nicky, for joining us and helping to expertly navigate the evening ahead. Nicky, over to you.
Thank you, Bruno. I will do my best. Yeah, as you say, it's quite interesting for me being invited to Enterprise Tuesday, because when I finished my undergraduate quite a while ago now in Cambridge, one of the next activities I did was get involved in entrepreneurship and the first Enterprise Tuesday sessions. And back then, I'm showing my age, but it was always a bit of a struggle to get sustainability onto the agenda. So it's been a remarkable shift over the last couple of decades, and of course over the last 5 years in particular. One of the questions I visited during my PhD years ago was, why could now be the right time to try and get entrepreneurs in the sustainability space active and scaling up? And there are often question marks. Was this the role of government? Should it be a venture-backed activity? Should this even be a space for entrepreneurs to operate in? And now we see a completely different context. Of course, you've just mentioned COP26. It's not just about climate change. Climate change is a huge threat to many of the sustainable development goals. We've seen extreme weather patterns. There are certainly other enormous issues off the back of the pandemic. One issue of great concern is that gender equality in many countries has also gone backwards. We've also seen the lack of resilience in countries, coming from a lack of equality, also had a light shone onto it. And all of these issues are interconnected. I think all of the entrepreneurs talking today are in the space of purpose-driven ventures, and looking at not just the commercial, but also how hopefully to try and make the world a bit of a better place. So let me introduce them, or rather invite them to introduce themselves. Can I first ask Peter, so your name, your venture, and where you are in this journey?
Hi, I'm Peter Pedersen. I'm currently a final year PhD student in experimental astrophysics. But in my spare time, I founded something called open-Seneca, quite early stage. And what we do, we monitor air quality in developing countries using the medium of citizen science and low-cost sensors.
Brilliant, thanks, Peter. Isabelle?
Hi, I'm Isabelle Gough. I'm a co-founder of Cercula, which is an online platform that serves construction carbon metrics. I'm a sustainability consultant by trade, but founded Cercula to try and make some more impact in the construction industry. We're very early stage. We started building software in January, and we're currently on the Bethnal Green Ventures Tech for Good program.
Brilliant, thank you. Stefan next.
Stefan, co-founder of Phycoworks, spent the past 4.5 years doing a PhD in algae biotech, where I was genetically engineering algae to produce things like drugs and fragrances more sustainably, and then decided that I wanted to try something a bit more applied, and so went through the Entrepreneur First program and co-founded Phycoworks, and we're quite early stage as well. We've been around for around 7 months now, incorporated officially in June, and yeah.
In June, yeah, a rapid journey. And Aidan.
Thanks very much, Nicky, and thanks very much for the invitation to come and talk today. So I'm Aidan O'Sullivan. I'm CTO and co-founder at Carbon Re, and we have just completed our seed raise of £1 million, which has been supported by UCL Tech Fund and Cambridge Enterprise, as well as the Clean Growth Fund. So I'm also associate professor at UCL as well.
Okay, brilliant. So we do have some questions for today, and I expect that we will deviate from them in our discussion. We are also inviting you, the audience, to submit some questions on the Q&A. If those questions come in early, I can't promise to keep on top of all of them. So if you feel like your question isn't being answered, please do try asking it again. We will try and keep an eye on it. And then there's a bit of a freer part at the end of the discussion where we can really get into some of those questions coming from the audience. As someone who's been in this space, there were tensions in working in academia and then talking about startups, and that's something that has become much more normalized. But I am intrigued with all of you about your journey from academia into business, why you felt that setting up was as a venture was the right way to create impact. Also, if you're continuing to juggle those two different roles and how you see that going forward. So I'd love to have your impressions of how you're dealing with these two sides, academia and in a venture, and the right way to create impact. Maybe I can start with Aidan.
Sure. Yeah, happy to speak on that. So I guess as you mentioned, it's kind of becoming a bit more normalized to do these things, but in some sense, I feel like academia is a very good background, or a very good kind of training ground for entrepreneurship. Doing a PhD, you're very much doing your own research and developing your own projects and solving your own problems, which is a good preparation for for taking on the challenge of starting a company. From my own kind of personal perspective, the ambition with Carbon Re is to have gigatons of impact. That's why we focused on the cement industry as our primary focus to begin with. As part of the product we're developing. And the cement industry is one that if it were a country, it would be the third largest emitter in the world as a sector. So the idea was to have impact from the start, and then it was kind of a case of how do you do that? And in some sense, a commercial vehicle felt like the true way to have impact in terms of something that would scale up and benefit from revenue and things like this. So I think as an academic, while you want to do research, you also want to see that research developed and go out into the world and get used. And there's more to it than just writing papers. There's also the chance to do that, which is what inspired the venture as well. So I guess the nice part of academia is a lot of the opportunity to do things and engage on these kind of projects, but impact is really becoming more and more important as an academic career. And we have impact through our students that we train, and this was a way that I felt to have further impact on actual emissions, and that's what we'll be measuring ourselves as a success. How do we impact the emissions of the world, and how do we keep track of what we're taking out of the balance?
And is that a view that you share, Peter? You're of course very much juggling at the moment, I think.
Yeah, I'm at the crossroads, I suppose. So yeah, I'm quite interested to hear the other panelists on their thoughts. I suppose academia is about kind of expanding the forefront of our understanding. In my case, I'm trying to understand our place in the universe, but it isn't necessarily my academic work isn't about fighting the ongoing climate change. And so that's why I kind of wanted to do something different with my spare time. And that's why I founded open-Seneca. I wanted to touch upon a point that was raised about kind of feeling guilty doing something different from your academics. like when I first started open-Seneca with my friends, I felt very shy to talk about it in front of my supervisor or mention at all that I was doing it, because I felt like he would think that I wasn't working on my PhD. But thankfully, within the Cambridge space, it's quite well promoted to do entrepreneurship, and I think you can have a much greater impact in the world when you kind of focus on entrepreneurship, because sometimes academia can be very limiting. At least in my experience, when you want to, let's say, purchase a piece of equipment, it can take months. And in my case, it's taken nearly 2 years to buy one piece of equipment for the lab. And just because there's so many barriers put in place, and it's for your safety, but it's also very annoying. And that's why I think kind of the entrepreneurship space kind of has less barriers and has a much greater reach in creating an impact.
So, Peter, what do you think it would take to jump into your venture full time, or is that what you're trying to evaluate right now?
Yeah, probably some funding would be nice, but we haven't quite pursued that yet, since we're all in our kind of the height of our PhDs. We want to finish that before kind of diving deep into the funding seeking.
Brilliant. Isabelle, do you have some thoughts you'd like to share?
Sure, yeah, my first one would be congratulations, Peter, for juggling not only a PhD, but starting a business. I can't imagine doing the two at the same time. It's really, really impressive. So personally for me, my kind of journey, I always imagined myself going into academia. And I thought that was the true path to fighting climate change. And I went to Greenland, I went to the Arctic, and I studied permafrost, and I found it quite paralyzing, and just quite a large emotional toll. And that's actually the point I started protesting and taking direct action, because I felt it was quite difficult to observe these huge climate tipping points without being able to take any absolute action on it. So I joined the UK Youth Climate Coalition, shout out, an amazing organisation. And we did coordinated campaigns to combat the coal and gas lobby. However, I found that very frustrating as well, as I saw very little change there. And then as I started my professional career and I started working on actual construction projects, one of our first projects that we did was just a housing development of 50 units, relatively small scale actually, the construction industry. However, the ESG that came out of that is that we saved 8,000 tons of carbon on that one development in whole life carbon terms. So after that, that was my first kind of tangible and measurable change that I felt that I had made, that first piece of impact. And since then, I've just wanted more. So that's kind of been the circular journey. And now we've managed to set actual tangible carbon goals that we're working towards, which is probably one of the most rewarding things that I've managed in my short career. But yeah, I think entrepreneurship offers that scale of impact, which is what we so desperately need at this point in time.
Yeah, interesting. Stefan, you've been on I suppose with Entrepreneur First a bit more of a structured journey. Tell us about your decision to go into that and where you're at now.
Yeah, sure. So I think with academia, the day-to-day work can feel a little bit far removed from the potential impact of the research. sort of start off with the introduction of a paper talking about how your research is going to cure cancer, or in this case, solve climate change. And by the time you're at the discussion stage, it's a much more nuanced, discussion of something that's maybe relevant to a room full of people, or a partial solution to a bigger problem that ticks the novelty box, but is going to actually be adopted in industry. And so I thought that was a bit frustrating, and I wanted to try something that was maybe a bit more applied. And so applied for the Entrepreneur First program, which for those who don't know is sort of like Love Island for the first 3 months and then Dragons Den for the next 3 until you get the funding. And so that was a really structured way to get into entrepreneurship and provide a lot of sort of training and mentorship. And I think really ease the transition from academia to entrepreneurship. I think the speed of entrepreneurship is what really sets it apart for me. It's, you can academia, I think both cases, Aidan raised this point that there are parallels between research and entrepreneurship. I agree. I think in both cases you're testing hypotheses, whereas in academia you might have to set up an experiment that takes ages to get results from it. In entrepreneurship, you can call up people, call up customers, validate some of your assumptions quite quickly, and quite quickly see the impact of that as well. So I think the speed and the reduced time to impact is what drew me to it.
Yeah, it's an interesting program. So Carbon 13 that I'm with is also a venture builder program, but it's very much directed at the climate emergency. But of course, entrepreneurship isn't right for everybody. I think we'd be fair to say that, and having a venture isn't always the right way of creating impact. So I'm going to slightly push back on all of you and ask for someone to chat about where you think, having a venture isn't the right vehicle to do something. Who's going to start us off? I'm going to go for Aidan. He's looking keen.
Well, I guess in some sense it's maybe the opposite side of the coin in terms of, when is academia the right kind of path and the right way to do things. And in some sense, we've talked about the need for scale and the need for speed. But in some cases there are a lot of benefits to a PhD or to having the time to explore ideas, even if it is slow and frustrating at times. But there is something that I quite like, having had a number of PhD students in my lab, and the idea that someone at kind of 26 or 28 or 23 is kind of given 4 years of funding on the basis that they are somebody that society deems interesting and trustworthy enough to give 4 years worth of funding to go explore a problem, and the problem is of interest to society enough that the government is willing to fund it. So in those kind of cases, maybe it's a slightly romantic view of things, but it is a kind of a horses for courses when knowledge generation takes time, and taking that pressure off people to go out into the world and develop something immediately and succeed or die trying, kind of, in a way. The other kind of side of academia of allowing people room to grow and room to develop ideas and to develop a field has its place in society, and is really valuable, I think.
I agree. I mean, I'm very interested by Isabelle and Peter, because both of you have had, and this is what I think is kind of the heart of entrepreneurship, is quite an experimental approach. So Isabelle, you've tried lots of different things. You seem like a very purpose-driven individual, and you've been trying to find the best way that you can create impact. And Peter, you've sort of gone, it's a crazy hobby to have, Peter. Set up this little thing on the side that seems to be doing quite well. But it seems at a point where it has gained some traction, and there's a possibility of doing some quite interesting things with it. So again, that experiment could have gone quite differently and perhaps given you a slightly different perspective on the options going forward.
I think with open-Seneca, we've had the luxury of time as well, much like some parts of academia does have. Just for the reason that all the people that have co-founded open-Seneca have also been doing PhDs, so we've been financially funded by governments to do our PhDs, so we've had the luxury of time because of that to continue with open-Seneca. And I think it is nice to have this luxury of time, but not everyone has it. And those who want to go to entrepreneurship sometimes, it's kind of like a rat race at times, which is not that nice. So I can't really speak much about that.
No, it's fine. And then Isabelle, I mean, it's quite interesting hearing about your journey, and you have tried, you know, from being an activist through to, you know, academic activist, entrepreneur, which is quite an interesting journey to go through.
Yeah, it's kind of almost you've gone to the dark side in some some definitions. So
I know other people who have done it, but yeah, they felt similarly. But yeah,
yeah, it's kind of interesting. So I was thinking about it in the terms of the COP actually. So we used to UK YCC used to send delegates to COP, and they were part of an observer group called the Youngo. So it's the youth NGOs almost who were there to observe the COP. But I realize now if I went, I'd be part of the Bingo, which is the business and industry NGOs who would be observing. And the two were almost at loggerheads actually when they were campaigning. It was almost like a conflict of interest. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting dichotomy. However, I think although there are many pitfalls you can fall into kind of as an entrepreneur, you are under a lot of pressure to kind of grow at all costs and look after your bottom line. And that can, you know, have a lot of traps such as accepting venture capital from maybe somebody who is not aligned with your mission, vision, and values, to serving a client who perhaps does not have, you know, uphold your verticals and perhaps is trying to use you as a tool to greenwash. I think as long as you are very strict and follow a certain set of values when you do business, I think that is the most important thing about leading a venture and being an entrepreneur, is to stay true to your mission. And there's a number of ways you can track that, including following a theory of change or measuring certain impact metrics. But I'm sure we'll talk more about that in this session.
Yeah, absolutely. And Stefan, you've been through quite a compressed version of this, and there's something quite interesting about the Venture Builder program when you bring a bunch of people together who've already decided to do something, even if they haven't quite decided exactly what. Tell me a bit more about your teaming process, and how many of you are working together at this point.
Yeah, so the way they structure the program is that you have 3 months of what's called form, where you basically engage with everybody else who's on the cohort, and then quite quickly decide whether you have complementary skill sets or similar sort of interests or values, and then based off of that, come up with an idea which you then use the rest of the program to test and ideally come up with a business out of that. And so EF has quite a structured framework for that. They have this concept of edge, which is what your unique insight onto an area is or your unique technical background. And so you look for edge complementarity and you fit of your edge to tackle a particular problem and come up with a particular solution. And so that sort of shapes the whole ideation process. You're evaluating, is this a good use of my edge? Does my edge fit with my co-founder's edge? And then the proof of that is the traction that you can get with initial customer conversations. I think it helps when you have such a short period of time to form a team to have that structure to it.
Yeah. So I was hoping we could sort of slightly shift the conversation. I noticed that someone is also asking about this in the chat, but one of the changes, and it's a really dynamic space for this, but how you really unite profit with purpose. Now, I'm very much of the belief that we live in the world in which we live. I think we can all admit that there are some structural problems with how it's currently run, and you might even have some criticisms of the capitalist system. But in my opinion, if we were to wait for that all to be sorted out, we would be in a terrible place. We kind of have to work within the system that we have and try and shift it from within whilst trying to create impact now. And it is quite a challenging space. So we know that carbon prices have been shifting enormously. The EU ETS trading scheme, so emissions trading scheme, has had an all-time high recently of around 65 euros per tonne of CO2. Of course, many would say that's still not high enough. But we've also seen some crazy prices for things like direct air capture. And it's not just about carbon pricing. There's a whole debate around carbon offsets. We're seeing how things develop at COP26 with international carbon markets. There's also the idea of a green premium, where you're offered two products, but one of them is greener, more eco, and you're prepared to pay a premium for that. But we've consistently seen an action sort of intention gap, where people say they will pay a certain amount, but in reality they don't. And then sometimes we see businesses who, so energy efficiency, Aidan, I can imagine that's probably quite a big thing for you. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you're trying to bring these two things together, and what things are helpful in the world at the moment, and what things you're hoping are going to perhaps come on the horizon and make that commercial proposition even better for you. Should we start with Aidan, since I mentioned energy efficiency?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I completely agree with what you're saying. You know, you have to work in the world, you know, that we're operating in, and pragmatism is you know, really important, and you know, you have to be a little bit streetwise as well. I guess in terms of, you know, the profit versus purpose, the difference, I guess, with a lot of climate tech and sustainability kind of focused organizations is they maybe start with the purpose and then work back to the profit, and that's kind of how we've approached it. So we've thought about the impact that we want to have, and then how we translate that into a business model. Whereas with a, you know, a tech company, they immediately move to, you know, the business model that they want to have based on the technology and how they can do that. So in some sense, that means you work a bit harder as a climate tech company. You have to, you know, do more, and there's more for you to think about. So it puts a bit more of a challenge on you, and you know, you have to be aware of that, and you have to take that on as part of the pragmatism that's involved, and say, well, you know, this is what I want to do. And in order to do that, I have to, you know, stay in the game long enough to have that kind of impact that I want to have. You know, there's no point having a brilliant piece of technology and, you know, collapsing within 3 months before you can actually deploy it. So I think in terms of the, you know, handling the kind of the baggage that comes with sustainability and technology, it's kind of, the onus is on you as a founder and an entrepreneur to really translate that in the right way, and it can kind of work for you and it works against you. You know, on one hand, Carbon Re is a place where people who do machine learning and are interested in climate can come and, you know, bring their interests together. So, you know, you have that opportunity, and we have that kind of working in our favor as well. But in terms of talking to investors and things like that, you have to be conscious that you need to then switch into the commercial aspect of things, and that has to be as strong as any kind of impact that you want to have.
So to be a little bit specific, Aidan, you've spoken about going into, I think, cement factories. Presumably there is quite a strong energy efficiency play, but probably stronger than just putting an energy monitor in your home, which I know people would say is about a 10% difference. What is the energy efficiency play? And presumably that far outweighs the cost of your solution?
Yeah, so again, you know, it's the conversations we have generally are not on, we want to you know, help you reduce your emissions. It's much more around, this is what we can do and this is the impact it will have on emissions. So in terms of the energy efficiency technologies that we deploy, generally within you know, the cement industry where we started is a very low margin industry, and because of that, fuel costs are a significant impact. So any emissions impact we can have that reduce fuel will have a big impact on the bottom line. So generally they're working at a 2% margin. Their 50% of their costs are fuel, and if we can reduce fuel costs by 10%, which is what we are kind of working off as a base assumption for most plants, generally it varies from plant to plant depending on the processes, but then you're looking at having an impact on the bottom line that is, you know, attractive commercially, and it far outweighs the cost of our software. So again, to be specific, that's kind of what we're looking to deploy. And it becomes, it's a kind of commercially attractive proposition now, but with emissions trading factored in as well, it becomes a must-have in order to survive is kind of our business venture. So again, we don't think you can rely on those emissions trading schemes. We think it has to be commercially viable without that. But once those things do start to bite, then things will become very serious. And what we're all about doing is reducing the energy intensity of every ton of cement or steel that's produced.
Brilliant. Thank you for asking my direct question. Peter, I'm sort of curious about your model going forward, because I think, if my understanding is right, this started off as a bit of a, as I was saying earlier, a bit of an experiment. Let's see if we can kind of, you know, engage the crowd in helping us to understand air pollution. So tell me how you sort of seen that transitioning to something with potential commercial value.
Yeah, it's been difficult initially. It's kind of, well, we work with city councils and mayors, and trying to convince them that this new technology is going to benefit them has been tough. But thankfully, through grant funding and some academic papers, our work is being more trusted nowadays. And in terms of forming a business model, we're still working on it. It's early days, but the more you speak to people, the more you engage with the communities that we think could benefit, the more you understand where you can wriggle in and figure out where we can create a genuine business out of it. But yeah, it's trial and error, and it takes quite a bit of time.
Definitely. I mean, it's an obvious value add what you're doing. And I mean, this is a space, so I've worked with obviously clean tech, climate tech businesses where I'm focusing a lot of my time now, but I've also worked with a lot of social impact ventures, some of them where you would think, how could you actually turn that into a private enterprise? And the question that comes out is, who's going to pay? And I think you're in that classic position at the moment, Peter, where you know you have something of value, but it's really trying to connect that with someone who's willing to pay for that.
Yeah, I think we could completely pivot and be like a product manufacturer, in the sense that you can buy our sensor on Amazon, which I think would be nice. But then you take away the impact that you can make for cities and for people and communities. And we want to be the good people, and so it's tough to kind of keep our head above the water if we want to pursue this as a proper business. I mean, in the best scenario, we'll be funded by some philanthropic avenue, but early days.
Yeah, I have some thoughts on it. We should have a chat sometime.
I'd love to.
Stefan, I mean, you're quite early in this process. How are you seeing? You've got a slightly different proposition. I think you have started it more from, let's say, the tech angle. So tell us a bit more about where you are in your product development and when you think you're gonna, if you've done some customer discovery and what that looks like at this point.
Yeah, so with developing MVP, we wanted to get started quite quickly, and so we reached out to people who are already producing algae at scale in the industry to figure out how can we help make this more efficient using my co-founder's expertise in machine learning. And so we launched a pilot for that MVP and piloting that platform now with 4 customers, and that's really helped to get a real understanding of what the problems that the customers are facing. I think that's the most important thing at the early stages, is to really define the problem and to validate that it is a real problem. And I think Isabelle made a great point earlier when she was saying that some customers are interested in sustainability started from a greenwashing perspective. You want to make sure that you're emphasizing the upside as well. So not just the greenwashing potential, but also the value that you can create for their company. I think that massively improves the quality of conversations that you can have, and you can really dig into what the value proposition is. I think it's the same for investors. I mean, ultimately, especially if you're going for venture capital, they want to invest in companies that have the potential to be billion-dollar companies. And to do that, you need to show them that what you can do is going to be profitable rather than just have a purpose. I think ideally you want to do both, but especially for those discussions with investors and customers, you want to lean more on the profit or the value, maybe.
And Stefan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're doing is helping to effectively improve a process. So the applications could be various, is that right? In which case, how are you going about targeting your first MVPs?
Yeah, so we work with algae. That's what my background is in. And the big challenge with algae is in scaling production. The way we conceptualize it is that you broadly have two types of variables that affect the efficiency of your process. Your environmental variables, so things like temperature, pH, light intensity, and then also your biological variables. So what strain are you using? What are the genes in that strain? How are they being expressed under different conditions? And so that creates this quite complex parameter space of different variables that are interacting to determine how efficient your process is. And we're using machine learning to understand that space and then using that understanding to develop novel strains that are purpose-built for industrial application.
Okay, I've noticed you've slightly dodged my question there and gone into your comfort zone of talking about the tech, but that's okay.
No, I can follow it up. Sorry. What was the question?
No, it's fine. It's I think it's just a challenge with something like yours, because there are lots of different applications for algae and how you actually end up. But let's revisit that question another day, perhaps. Isabelle, obviously as an activist, it's a bit of a transition then saying, hey, we should perhaps be asking for money and money within a for-profit entity, I'm guessing. Are you also looking at raising investment? I think you mentioned earlier about having some kind of alignment, at least in vision, with people who are going to invest in your organization or perhaps clients that you're working with. So tell me a bit more about that. And have you had ethical challenges already? And commercially, do you feel like there's enough commercial pull for your product? And do you see that changing over the next few years?
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a huge shift. And it's difficult to get comfortable as well with the levels of growth that are expected from you as an early stage venture. I think when you first start doing your projections, that's not a sphere that I come from. I'm not from a finance background whatsoever. So everything that I projected when I started was extremely modest. And that is not what it's not what investors are looking for. So you have to get comfortable with this idea of kind of exponential hockey stick growth. And that is a huge pressure and perhaps not why you started your venture in the first place. However, that growth feeds your impact, and it's important to remember that and be able to project that as well with your growth metrics. So one way that we've kind of tackled that in Cercula is not only having our financial milestones that we want to meet, but also matching that with our impact milestones as well. So tracking your impact and measuring your impact is super important as a Tech for Good platform. I'd say pick a few key metrics that you really feel uphold your mission, and make them in a scale that you can meet, and it really helps you feel like you're meeting your goals. I think also setting out a clear mission, vision, and values is really important. A good piece of reading material to start off if you're starting an impact venture is Start With Why. And that basically sets out how to build your business in a way that solves the problem that you want to see changed in the world. So what do you want to change? How do you envision the world after you've changed it? And how do you want to get there? What will make you feel comfortable with how you've carried out business to achieve your mission? Another important thing about tracking your impact is also tracking your negative impact, because although you are, perhaps you are reducing a certain tonnage of CO2 in the built environment, say for Cercula's case, there could also be a negative social impact associated with that. So impact tracking is just so important, and it's good to have a high level view of it, and also a measured granular view as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's a point well made. And since I've been in this space, I've seen the way that ventures are approaching how you measure impact become much more sophisticated. And a lot has been demanded, because no longer do we live in a world where it's okay to say, hey, I'm a good person, I'm out there doing good. You actually have to show a track record and have some credibility in what you're saying. I think it would be impossible not to talk about carbon because of COP26. And as someone who's been in this space, and I have helped organizations look at carbon from an innovation perspective, I think the alarming thing is that when you actually get into the detail, there are a lot of errors in how we report on carbon. So we talk very emphatically about these targets, but when it comes down to just measuring the impact of a coffee cup, how you use your assumptions and which databases you're referencing can give you some wild variation in your final figures. So, which is why I think that the world needs to exercise a little bit more caution about their targets. I mean, considering if we get it wrong, it's going to be quite disastrous, but and it's something, of course, that companies have woken up to and committed to, net zero targets, but how different organizations are interpreting those targets and different countries varies. So if you are interested in this space, do have a look at what is and isn't included within those figures. You've mentioned that link, Isabelle, between environmental and social, and one of the last things I wanted to discuss was sometimes seen as a bit of a tricky topic, but I think that you cannot have an impact venture without really thinking about who is operating, who's involved in the design process. And that's entrepreneurship in the tech space have been criticized for a lack of inclusivity, and it's led to some catastrophic design errors. So I don't know if people have seen racist hand sanitizers, which only respond to white hands and not black hands. Seat belts in cars, so crash test dummies are in a male shape, and actually women are 70% more likely to get injured in a car accident. We know that decision-making, so partners in venture capital firms, around 2.5% of those in the partnership level are female at the moment. So we have a range of issues, and it's one of the things we're trying to address at Carbon 13, and many other people are as well. So as entrepreneurs, we have an opportunity to try and build ventures in a slightly different way. And I'd love to hear the group's reflections on this. Who's perhaps so Peter, I think you've got quite a mixed team actually, partly because people are doing this part-time, but tell me about maybe the opportunity to work with a variety of different people in developing something.
Yeah, it's interesting. We all have very different backgrounds. So as in, we have chemists, computer scientists, engineers, and then you have an astrophysicist like myself. But it's not just us involved in the design process of what we've made. we tried, in the beginning, we had very much a co-curation approach, where we had traveled to meet people who were interested in air quality. In this case, it was in Nairobi in Kenya, and we were trying to understand what the local challenges were there in getting a good air quality data set. And likewise, we had spoken to other people in other places around the world, in South America and in Asia. And it was, incredibly important to get these views in, because we had some preconceived idea of what was the best product to make. But I think we were wrong in the beginning, and it was necessary to absolutely to speak to everyone from all walks of life, because we're trying to target as many people as possible. So it's if I had any advice, speak to your customers, but also speak to your end users, who may not be the customers, paying customers, but they are in the end the people who will be using your thing.
Yeah, a brilliant answer. Stefan, has this been something that's have you had any issues in this space, or noticed any opportunities for improvement? You're on mute.
As a whole, my experiences have been fairly good. I mean, I can't claim to speak for every or any disadvantaged group, but I think the two main advantages that sometimes more privileged sort of backgrounds can provide, I think, are network and confidence in this space. And I think that on the network front, people in entrepreneurship, I think, are very happy to help, and especially if you're working on something that has the potential to make a brighter future, and even more so if you're not trying to sell them anything yet or ask them for money. So I think just reaching out to people, looking for potential mentors, and then when the time comes, repaying the favor and becoming a mentor to someone who reaches out for help is the way to go on that front. I think on the confidence front, I think it's more subtle. It's a slightly harder one to address. There's always an advantage to pitching to a room full of people who look, speak like you, went to the same schools as you. But I think leaning into the aspects of your background or your identity that make you uniquely positioned to tackle a particular problem or particular solution is something that can actually add a personal touch to the story that you're creating, the vision that you're trying to communicate with your startup. And so I definitely recommend leveraging those things that make it different, rather than sort of treating them as obstacles.
Yeah, and Isabelle, you mentioned, I think, modest projections, and certainly there have been some interesting studies looking at female and male founders and the propensity to have overly ambitious projections, but then women perhaps have more realistic projections and ultimately hit their projections, when sometimes men are less likely to do so. So there are some interesting challenges there. But is this an issue that you've become aware of, or that's important to you?
Yeah, this is actually an issue very close to my heart. Done some campaigning on this as part of Women in Tech. They do great work on diversity and inclusion in the tech space. We lose a lot of good talent from just being an uninclusive industry. As far as the entrepreneur space goes, diversity is a huge problem. It's almost unilaterally white males that are receiving venture capital funding. And I think that's probably where the issue stems from. So I think a report just came out that said for every £1 spent on venture capital, 99% of that went to mixed gender and all male founding teams. And I think it was actually 89% that went to all male founding teams. So there's a huge gender gap when it comes to receiving venture capital funding. And, as more underrepresented groups are added to that, the proportion goes even further down. So we certainly have a big challenge there. And it's actually a shame because entrepreneurism, the whole space of innovation has such a good opportunity to close the gender wealth gap and all of these inequalities that we have in our society, but we're failing to do so. So I think that's something that we need to address as an industry. Another problem, I think it comes from the next layer, which is the founding team's hiring strategy. What tends to happen in an early stage is you're at a grow at all costs kind of mindset, and diversity and inclusion is just not really prioritized. And it often leads to, oh, well, I'll hire my friend because I know that they're really good at this. But you're hiring from the same space that you started from. And so it becomes a bit of a closed loop kind of system. However, there's a lot of diversity and inclusion methodologies out there that we can all try and employ. And I think it would be a good idea if we did. Just such as when you're hiring for somebody, you can leave all of their details off the CV. So you just have their kind of experience and skills there. At the end of the day, D&I is about finding the right person for the right role. So it's only going to improve your business, and you'll build such a rich and stable business out of having these measures from the outset.
Yeah, it's I mean, actually the research is pretty clear. As I said, you know, mixed founding teams tend to perform better, tend to have a greater tendency to hit targets. So and also you bring that rich diversity in perspectives, not just in terms of understanding your target market, but also how you address various design challenges. So there's really good evidence to say why we should be doing better at this, but it is still currently an effort to do it well. Aidan, obviously you're in the privileged group, I suppose. You tick a number of boxes here. Is this something that you've thought of or see as an opportunity with your venture?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a climate perspective, you know, in order to solve this problem, everybody needs to contribute, and there needs to be room at the table for everybody. I think in terms of how it relates, how it impacts kind of startups, you know, it's very much when you find yourself pitching and entering the venture capital world, it's an incredibly, you know, it's where the wealth is, and that's where the privilege is, and you kind of have to recognize that and kind of do what you can accordingly to, you know, the fact that you might not have the same network as, you know, or be part of the or background of the people you're pitching to, and try and adapt accordingly. You know, it's great that things like Carbon 13 are out there doing good work and helping tackle some of these problems, but you know, it is the majority of that world, and it's not a world that you're going to get much exposure to until you are in the room pitching them. So I guess in terms of what can you do? I mean, structurally, it would be great if there were changes, but those are kind of a longer term and harder to control. So I guess I would echo what kind of Stefan says, and the best thing you can do to kind of tackle those things is to give yourself every advantage that you can to overcome some of those, say, disadvantages due to your background that you might not have going into that environment. So be as well prepared as you can, and be as confident as you can, and give the best pitch you can, and hopefully it will go well for you.
Yes, it's a really interesting space, because this term imposter syndrome, I had a debate with someone a couple of years ago, and they said, how could an entrepreneur have imposter syndrome? Entrepreneurs, aren't they supposed to be really confident and have utter belief in what they're doing? And I've worked with lots of entrepreneurs that have suffered with terrible imposter syndrome, because we do have such limited visibility in many ways of who should be an entrepreneur and who is a successful entrepreneur. So I hope that everyone gets some comfort from the fact that many people are actually suffering from imposter syndrome. It doesn't mean you don't have belief in what you're doing or confidence in what you're doing, but as you were saying, Aidan, sometimes it's about knowing who you're talking to and standing up and playing a role, and really understanding what that role is at that point in time, and hopefully having good people around you who can support you with that. But yes, we all have a challenge in this space, and please, for those who are listening, if you think, oh, I don't know if I'm the right person to be an entrepreneur, leave that to others. If there's something that's deeply frustrating and troubling you, and you think you just want to explore it, or a solution that you think you might have found that you're interested in, start talking to people, because there is no one entrepreneurial archetype. People get into this space for all sorts of different reasons. Thank you so much, everybody. I've noticed that we have a variety of different questions. Some of them, I've sort of kept a little eye on them. So some of them I think that we have addressed to some extent. I am going to start at the top, and we've got a senior director in a large pharma. So presumably on, quite a nice salary with, a lot of resource available, and how you actually support the transition financially. So perhaps someone with some responsibilities there. I'm going to start this off, if I may. So even though we've spoken quite positively about being entrepreneurs, I would typically advise someone, don't do it for as long as possible. So if you can be working on your idea or the problem space in a relatively safe environment, do so for as long as possible. And then when you really feel like you have to throw yourself into it because you've built up some momentum, then that's perhaps the time to leap. I also know often people in pharma will then try and negotiate. If you're working in a big company, you'll try and negotiate perhaps and try and take a bit of IP or possibly some co-investment with you, which is the other thing to have a think about. But do any of the panel want to say, how they've managed that challenge of fiscal responsibility, that and how you make that leap into the unknown?
I'm happy to go.
Thank you, Isabelle.
Yeah, it's really, really scary. I think everyone would agree that taking that leap is just the hardest part of it. But I'd echo what Nicky says. Not many companies can bootstrap from the get-go. So usually there is something that helps you take the leap, whether that's a grant fund approval, whether that's you get into an accelerator and they give you a bit of funding. There's usually something that will help you bridge that gap. Failing that, I've had a friend who saved up just a lump of savings, and when they felt they were comfortable enough to cover perhaps 6 months of salary, they went for it. But yeah, there's really no good time to do it. But just give yourself a little bit of runway, and then when you feel like you're ready, just make the leap.
It's just going back to the diversity, I know we spoke about gender, but I think unfortunately a lot of tales of entrepreneurship do come from quite privileged backgrounds, and that's something that we're still fighting to overcome. Yeah, and I have heard some quite disingenuous stories of people going, yes, I'm an entrepreneur and I made it all by myself, and that it's just doesn't work like that. Usually there are a ton of people in the background who are helping to lift you up as along your way, and we need to be need to recognize that. Aidan, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's definitely true. I guess the only thing I would add is kind of as well, what are you prepared to do to to make this a success? Are you prepared to work at the weekends? Are you willing to work in the evenings? Some of these things when you're bootstrapping, it's a case of how much do you want and what are you prepared to put into it. So if it's a case of, well, I like my 9 to 5 and I just feel like being an entrepreneur who does a 9 to 5, that's not going to work. You do have to accept that you're doing something that takes, a lot of you. You have to put a lot of yourself into it. And, if you're not in the position where you can do that, it takes a lot of thinking about, and it depends on, maybe you can find other ways to get there or people to work with, but it depends how much you want it, I guess, as well. And if it's a case of I'm curious, or if it's a case of I have to do this, that's kind of what you should be baking your decision based on.
I say probably the other thing that we think is really important and is a foundation at Carbon 13, I know is as well at Entrepreneur First. It's really hard being a sole founder, because it is, there are the ups and downs, and there is a great joy to working within a team, with a shared purpose, even if you're working hard and, doing everything that you can. But we're all allowed an off day. And it's fantastic when you're having an off day to have someone else in the team to, kind of pick up the pieces and help keep the momentum going. So I would say that is another key thing to explore, is who else you might want to go into a venture with. There seem to be people who are very much, there's a question about how do you balance academic entrepreneurship? Do you focus on impact, innovative research, or making more revenue, or both? What is the boundary line? I mean, it's such a tough question to answer. And Peter, you're in the thick of it right now. So I'm going to leave you to one side and go to Stefan, because Stefan, you made a very deliberate decision to join Entrepreneur First. Was it just a case of good timing, or was this something you'd been thinking about for a while? You mentioned some frustrations with academia. Tell us a bit more about that decision point.
Yeah, it was something I've been thinking about for a while, and the structure of the program appealed to me. I think one way to ease a transition is to look for programs like that. There are quite a few of them now. I think Entrepreneur First isn't the only one. I think once you do make that leap, though, you do have to make the leap. You can't be sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And like Aidan was saying, you can't sort of do a job on the side and then do the entrepreneurship on the side. You can certainly lay some of the groundwork and test some of the early hypotheses about whether this is a real problem. But then once you're in, you have to be committed. I think it was a sort of natural transition for me coming out of the PhD. Could have done a variety of different things. But I thought, well, I have this opportunity here, I might as well take it. And I'd encourage anyone who's in that position where they have that opportunity and the only thing keeping them back is this belief that maybe they're not ready enough, to just take the jump and then to learn on the job. And I think that's the only way that you can. I think that's the nature of the game, is you'll never be ready enough. We'll never have perfect information to take the leap, but you just sort of have to come to an acceptable point and then just do it.
And that's good judgment, whatever that means, right? An acceptable point, yeah. There's a question quite specifically about regulation and commitments. So do any of you see some regulation or policy items that you think could be quite advantageous for your ventures that are perhaps coming on the horizon?
Yeah, sure. We've just had a recent mandate by the Greater London Authority for whole life carbon metrics on schemes over 2,000 meters squared, I think, and over 50 units. So policy is definitely going in our direction for sure. What we are trying to do is develop ahead of that, so that when the time comes that it needs to be mandated nationwide or on smaller planning developments as well, we're ready for to provide that. So the way that we're trying to do that is make it as simple and easy as possible for people with perhaps a very loose understanding of embodied carbon and whole life carbon to be able to adopt this technology very easily. So it's for us, I guess it's trying to help the industry as well as trying to help implement that policy when it comes.
Peter, there's a couple of comments about air quality, but before we get to them, I mean, obviously we do see air quality in the news. Why do you think that that's hard to translate down to, you know, having better air quality monitoring, even in a, you know, through a crowd or distributed model? Why do you think that people are still not properly paying for that insight?
Well, I think it mainly stems from a lack of awareness. Like, air quality has kind of two things. One, the main thing, it affects your health. And then the second thing, which is obviously linked to, is climate change, depending on the type of pollutant. But if they are aware that air quality isn't good, bad air quality isn't good for them, sometimes they just don't want to know. There are places which we want to deploy sensors in, but the countries or local governments don't want their citizens to know that they're breathing in bad air, because they have much larger problems to be facing at the moment. So and also there are recommendations by WHO for air quality, but they're just recommendations. They're not enforced. London is taking really good steps in the direction of improving the air quality there, as in now there's an ultra low emission zone that's been recently expanded, which is great. But yeah, the primary issue is a lack of awareness.
Yeah, it's interesting. Someone said in the chat, anyone considering moving house would likely value knowing what the air quality was, you know, in that area, which is quite an interesting idea, especially if you could then start putting that into the property search.
Yeah, it's been mentioned to us before, and I think that would be really interesting. But people also forget that air quality can be worse inside the house than it is outside. Yes. from cooking on an open fire or all those type of things.
Yeah. There's another question here, which is relating to raising funds and whether investors are becoming more sensitive to the actual sustainability potential of your venture, or is profit still what they're after? Aidan, you've just raised some dosh. What was that process like? What was the balance between impact and you know, the financial projections?
Sure. Yeah, it was a very tough process. You know, we definitely had a few knocks along the way. I guess there's a bit of a balance in that there are funds who are specifically focused on climate tech and supporting innovation that reduces emissions. So one of our investors, Clean Growth Fund, only invests in those kind of technologies. So in some sense, that means we were playing in a reduced space, but they didn't give us an easy ride on commercials. So you do certainly still have to have a solid business case behind your project, and it can't just be all about sustainable impact. But there are certain advantages you do get in terms of there are funds dedicated to supporting that, and hopefully more of those will continue on. And I guess in some sense, looking towards the future, this is the direction of travel, and it's something businesses have to be aware of, and will be taken into consideration more as funding is developed. So it's not the case that you can kind of say, I want to have lots of impact and I'm going to reduce emissions and this is how. You still have to say, and here is the business case behind it.
One of the things I did pick up from when you were talking is you mentioned the mitigation potential of 1 gigaton. We've seen some funny numbers flung around this space. And of course, that's a number that some of the investors are looking for. Is that something that you were aware of?
I think it wasn't something we kind of picked up from investors. It was more something that was, core to our interests. And again, I think it was much more, okay, that fits, that qualifies you to come and talk to us. Now show us the commercial success of this. So show us the commercials and how this will work out. So it can open doors, but it definitely won't get you over the line.
Yeah. So we've been doing quite a lot of work at understanding where some of these numbers are coming from, and we've actually got a methodology that we take the ventures through, but we've seen there's quite a tension between some top-down and bottom-up calculations in this space. And of course, it's all very much tied to your growth aspirations and how you're supporting that through your financial projections. The two are tied together, that additionality and that scalability. So it's be wary of some of the numbers, be aware of the game, and as you said, if someone needs to hear a particular number, but then how you're supporting your journey to achieving that. Stefan, did your impact come up in EF, or was it predominantly looking at financial projections?
It was part of the narrative, but I'd echo what Aidan said, that ultimately when you're speaking to VCs, it's about the market opportunity, unless it's a fund that's specifically geared towards impact, where that is maybe weighted more in their decision. I think in most cases, though, you do have to show a clear path towards becoming a unicorn, ideally, because that's how the VC model works, is that they need at least one unicorn in their portfolio to return their fund. And so they're investing in companies that have the potential to be that unicorn. And so I think that is something that you absolutely need to have in the pitch if you're going for VC money, which isn't necessarily essential if you want to found a business. There are other options out there as well.
So this is not nagging at all, according to John. I love that he sort of prefaced that, but is there still the perception sometimes that when you are talking about sustainability, that it does come across as nagging or an irritant somehow, and that you are being an activist and not a business? Is that something that you've encountered? Peter, I'm going to go to you.
Was this question directed at me?
No, I was going to ask Peter, but Isabelle, if you want to go for it.
Sorry. I think what you need to do as a business is communicate the value of sustainability as well. If you can show that value proposition, and more often than not, there's always savings to be made by being more sustainable. You can actually benefit people's bottom line as well, which is, the ideal situation. You're getting an economic benefit and a sustainable benefit as well. I think if it comes to sort of nagging people and businesses, I think that might be just a problem in your communication and messaging. And that's more about your branding and your tone, I guess, than your mission. I don't think anybody starts a business to annoy people, or at least I hope they don't.
Yeah, well put. Peter?
I think it is a good point to talk about the finances. Like in air quality, finances are kind of often just not known or forgotten about. But thankfully, there's been a lot of research happening in the past few years talking about finances and air quality. I mean, initially, yes, we would introduce ourselves as being like, we want to minimize air pollution and minimize X factory from blowing their plumes of whatever to that village. But yeah, I think if we change our approach to speaking to people and start talking about finances and seeing how that could benefit the economy as well as benefiting your health, that's I think that's the right way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, there's been such a shift over the last 3 years that I think it's unprecedented for companies and governments to commit to targets that they don't yet know how to achieve. And I think consumers equally have been making, various pledges, sometimes not always with the right action, but I think that how people feel about this space has shifted quite dramatically. There's a comment which I think is just a comment about, really trying to surround yourself with experts and advice before you launch anything, which I think is probably a very sensible thing to say. And then, of course, if you can access grants, I think someone mentioned that earlier, then that, again, is a very sensible place to start. At the top of the questions, there's something around B2C. So I think all of you are predominantly B2B, but Peter, you've got this kind of C angle.
Yeah, we're B2B2C.
Yeah. And how have you found that? I mean, has it been challenging to pull off, to really try and engage individuals rather than organizations?
Oh no, I think the individuals have been somewhat easy, because the people that we engage with are motivated already to help monitor air quality. But convincing kind of local governments fund such an initiative has been tough. As I said in the beginning, it was like it's a new technology that they don't necessarily trust it. So yeah, I don't know, I think it just takes time, but also it really helps if you have some academic support in that end.
I mean, I would say that if you're going to get the transformative change that we need, you need to be doing B2B and B2C. Some of the Bs that are around today might not be here tomorrow, and the way you get some of those shifts is also through B2C. Typically, Cambridge has not done as well with B2Cs as it has done with B2Bs. But there is great opportunity to engage with consumers in this space. Any carbon capture experts out of, someone's asked a question about, very open question, what do we think of carbon capture technologies and the opportunities? I do have some thoughts on it, but if there's anyone else with some insight.
Yeah, happy to chip in on that. It's certainly relevant to what we're doing, and a lot of the strategies that you see put out by large, cement organizations or large steel manufacturers, they kind of treat CCS as kind of, this silver bullet that's going to come along and solve all the problems, and they won't have to change anything. And in that sense, it's kind of, it's a problem as a technology, in that it kind of gives people something to hide behind and say it's okay to do nothing now. In 2030, we'll just install all this kit and everything will be fine. Don't worry about it. So in that sense, it can be an obstacle to people, improving things at the moment and doing better with what they have, when they're allowed to kind of look into the future and say, oh, there's going to be a technology which is still quite unproven, and at scale tends to be rather expensive. And again, once things start to develop, it's a little bit like hydrogen in a way that in theory it sounds great, but as soon as you move to implementation, you'll find that the costs skyrocket and things like this. So while it's early days and you'd be hopeful for it going into the future, any initial deployments are going to be really, really expensive. So it's something that we see as it will come along in the future, but it's not an excuse to do nothing now.
Yeah, it's an incredibly expensive way of dealing with carbon. I mean, you're seeing some figures of, I think this is quite a conservative figure, of $1,000 per ton of CO2, which is massively above, even the EU ETS, figure. Bearing in mind, most people can buy a tree at the moment at a fairly cheap price in some, perhaps not such good schemes for carbon offsetting. And I think the learning curves for direct air capture anyway are going to be pretty slow. There's bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, but the problem has not necessarily been the capture, it's the storage. And that's something we still haven't really solved. But yeah, of course there are opportunities, because the size of the challenge is so great that we actually do need everything. So I would never say in this space, am I picking the right thing? Because we actually do need to back everything. There's some quite fun tools that you can play around with online that really highlight that. Something called Climate Interactive, which you can have a play with, that really shows you that we do need everything in this space. I am going to wrap up. We're slightly ahead of schedule, but we seem to have reached a natural conclusion, I would say. And I just want to thank all of you for joining tonight, and thank you to all of the panelists. Some really excellent perspectives, and hopefully not the same old sort of glossy stories, so some real insights, because there's some really good opportunities that we need to solve right now, and we need some great minds to come together and really do that. We don't have all the solutions that we need to the challenges that we face in sustainability, and certainly from climate change. And I'm delighted that Isabelle, Stefan, Aidan and Peter are all looking at this issue, and I wish them all well with their ventures going forward.